Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I like to discuss the way Boris Johnson's nastiness really shone through in the COVID inquiry yesterday, as messages showed that he argued that COVID was just nature's way of dealing with old people. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So I discussed Dominic Cummings yesterday, and after his evidence, Boris Johnson said, well, he's a liar, isn't he? Well, yes, it's a fair way to characterise Cummings, even if it comes from another liar. But the messages revealed at the COVID inquiry don't lie. These are what the people at the time had committed to a written record without them thinking it was going to be scrutinised in public a few years later. These were their honest thoughts to each other. And some of the messages seen yesterday were fairly harrowing. Don't get me wrong, anyone who was paying attention in 2020 knew that Boris Johnson didn't really care about the impact of COVID on people, or at the least downplayed it. He didn't even take the risk seriously himself, hence his own illness. So why on earth would this narcissist care about the consequences for others? It's also no surprise to see the messages describing his overriding priority to keep the economy firing over people's lives. We knew that at the time. Not that in reality it was even a choice of priorities, because of the reckless way in which our COVID mitigations were carried out, such as they were. We ended up powering down the economy more frequently and for longer than necessary. Of course, if the workforce is too sick to work, of course your economy is going to suffer. Cannot say often enough. We actually had everything set up for us. Oh, we should be looking back now at like, oh, the UK did well. If it weren't for Johnson's stupidity, we had a pandemic response unit, which he trashed. We are an island, so had an easier job screening people coming into the country. We had more notice. I mean, it had swept through Asia. We were looking at that going, oh, we should learn lessons maybe. Going through Europe. It was going through Europe. We still had notice, and we should have been looking, oh, should we learn lessons? And we had two infectious disease experts in the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Officer roles. It was all set up for the UK to get away with a good response. Alas, we had Boris Johnson in charge. The least serious Prime Minister this country had ever had, up until that point anyway. But to listen to how he was justifying his appalling behaviour was a bit of an eye-opener, even for an ageing cynic like me. So in Patrick Vallance's notes, the Chief Scientific Officer, he had written that Johnson considered that old people should just accept their fate. In fact, more than that, he was suggesting that there was a widespread view amongst his own MPs that this was the case and that he agreed. So he had this notion, of course, completely discredited now, that COVID was somehow just something that was bad for old people. Oh, the young are fine, they just get a bit of a cough, and that's it. And then the older people are the ones who die. Oh, well, dear, how sad, never mind. But, you know, were even that the case, the callous way he was happy to just tell officials in a meeting that he thought that the elderly should just die to disease is fairly horrific. And it is, because I'd sort of, until I started looking at these messages yesterday, I had an image in my head of Boris Johnson just not prioritising lives. Like, you know, there's a list of priorities and he's thinking, oh, well, ignoring it so we can power up the economy, that's the priority, in lives further down, stuff like that. What this comment shows is he didn't actually value the lives at all. At all. It wasn't just they were lower priority, they weren't even on the priority list. And then you wonder how many of these elderly people, whose deaths Johnson thought was a price worth paying for not mitigating against the virus, actually voted for him just a few months earlier. And you also wonder what many of those Tory voters think now, or the surviving ones at least. Are they reevaluating things? Are they deciding that maybe they should be a little bit more careful about the quality of politician they support? Or are they coming up with excuses to justify their continued support? Because the notes didn't just reveal that Johnson felt this way. As I said, you know, they appeared, because he's gone. He's out of the picture now. Doesn't affect your voting decisions for the next election. But, you know, these notes were suggesting that Johnson was suggesting that a lot of Tory MPs felt this way as well. Now, how many sitting Tory MPs who are hoping to retain their seats at the next election on the back of elderly voters were privately telling their leader and each other that they thought that these same voters they're going to rely on next year should just die? How many? Remember that Johnson made a speech where he claimed that the UK should lead the world on literally ignoring the mitigations being put in place by other countries. That we should show the world what happens when you just let the virus sweep through the population. I mean, he sort of did, didn't he? In the end, he only changed course, too late, of course, when he got an inkling of the scale of the deaths he would be looking at. He realised that actually that's a bit much even for him to charm his way through. And to think, they were talking about trying to limit the deaths to 20,000 at the time. Oh, you know, a bad outcome would be 20,000 deaths. No. And people thought that was a lot as well. You know, the media would go, 20,000, that's a lot. That's not very ambitious, trying to keep it to 20,000. Ended up being far more, of course. And between Dominic Cummings' empire building, Boris Johnson's willful ignorance, and Rishi Sunak's zeal for raiding public funds, it's terrible to think of how many lives could have been saved, and how much productivity as well, if that's all the Tories care about, could have been saved, if only we'd had a competent, functional, ideally experienced government in place. Lee Kane, who was Johnson's Director of Communications at the time, was painting a picture of every major call being wrong. Like, never mind getting the big calls right. They got no calls right. And that is according to the people at the heart of the operation in 2020. And what they didn't tell the inquiry is all in the published messages. So we don't have to worry about who's telling the truth. Oh, well, they've got an axe to grind. Okay, maybe. We've got the messages. We can read what they were sending each other from that period of time. They had no axe to grind at that time. It is, of course, natural to mistrust many of the people given evidence this week. Absolutely. They will all want to protect their own reputation. And some want to actively trash the reputation of others, like Dominic Cummings. But when it's in line with the documentary evidence as well, it's not going to be feasibly dismissed. And Kane was recalling the decision, for example, to not continue free school meals for children in poverty over the summer. I remember that well. My MP at the time, to be fair, was not defending that policy decision. It was clearly going to be an unpopular policy, and she said she was, with other MPs, working on persuading the government to change its position. But other backbench Tory MPs seemed happy to support the government line. Kane said that the reason the government made this terrible policy misstep was because, in his words, the cabinet lacks diversity, to the point where none of them had ever experienced that level of poverty, so they didn't see the issue. And that is a problem, isn't it? And that's the problem we keep trying to explain with the fact that you have this lack of social diversity in the cabinet. Because, you know, this is something to remark on. Like, the Tories frequently hail their broad diversity of gender and ethnicity in cabinet, and okay, that's good to see. But almost all of them went to private schools. The rest came from well-off middle-class families. You know, there's a diversity of appearance. Sure, absolutely. And that's better than nothing. But there isn't a diversity of background there. Not a single one of them could tell you about how it feels not to know how to cover the bills, or had experience of parents struggling with bills. You know, in a month when, say, the car needs an unexpected repair. They've no experience in that. They don't understand that. And that was the problem. That's the point Kane was making. Because they didn't understand it, there was he called it a policy blind spot, I think. And that is still the problem now. That is ultimately the problem. You think, so, you know, why are the Conservatives completely ignoring the actual concerns of ordinary people right now? Are they stupid? Well, maybe a little bit. But it's because they've never experienced those problems. They don't actually see it as a problem. In their own heads, according to Kane, they're just thinking, well, okay, you're struggling a little bit at the moment. Don't worry, it'll be fine in a couple of years. Just get through it. That's what they're thinking. You know, then there was his evidence on Sunak's Eat Out to Help Out scheme. Kane said that they were really worried about it because it would mean needing more measures later on. So they knew that at the time. They were talking about that. They knew that it would drive another wave. He said that the scheme just didn't make sense. Now, of course, from a government point of view, no, it made no sense at all. But as a way to nick more public money, it made perfect sense. Of course, with Sunak's driving of the second wave and then Johnson's delay in locking down again, we ended up with a lot more lives being lost from this scheme as well. I mean, last week we were told maybe somewhere between 20 and 25,000 extra deaths. And we knew that they were being driven by greed at the time. And we knew it was because they understood nothing of science, and therefore found it easy to dismiss the advice of experts in pursuit of their ideology. Because after all, this was a cabinet assembled for its Brexit ideology, an ideology that made no sense. So Boris Johnson had created a cabinet who had to be of one mind on Brexit. And never mind just the cabinet, the wider parliamentary party, Tory MPs were only allowed to stand as candidates for the party if they committed themselves to Johnson's vision of Brexit. Now, some of them lied, but in cabinet, it was only the most committed Brexiteers, right, that were allowed in cabinet. So you already had a cabinet of very senior government ministers who had this driven by ideology, and they had to ignore the experts to maintain their Brexit ideology in their own heads. So they were already in the habit of ignoring experts. Then comes a pandemic. So of course they're going to carry on with the same behaviour. Of course we end up with a government with no interest in the real world because they've trained themselves to ignore the real world. It's a lie. They're in the matrix. And yes, we believed that they had a callous disregard for life. The assertion that Johnson said, let the bodies pile high, when warned about the consequence of delaying action during the second wave, something Johnson denies, of course. But to see the records of Johnson completely dismissing the lives of anyone who could be particularly vulnerable to the disease, somewhat takes your breath away to realise that these Tories really held no regard for life at all. It wasn't just lower priority, it was no priority. It wasn't just that they got their priorities wrong, it wasn't on there. And I noticed that today's front pages are starting to contain some of these details, which is good, about time. Of course, it's not just a case of these Tory MPs hoping to get past it. It's like Partygate, this will run. And the reason this will run is because it's going to take a long time for this inquiry. And at the end of it, there'll be a lot of speculation about what the final report will say. And then the final report will come out. That will be very big news. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.